Okay, energy politics. They've mentioned the concept techno-fix, which was a crucial concept running throughout the radical science movement. By this we meant that techno-fixes predefine the problem to be solved, technicize societal conflicts, depoliticize them, and channel protest into expert arguments. In this way, techno-fixes preempt debate about what future society is already being built through technological choices, which are presented really as not choices at all, but just as imperatives, or as simply rationality, as well as debate about what society should instead be built through different choices. So techno-fixes play this regressive anti-democratic role regardless of how well or how badly the fixes deal with the problems that they have predefined. The energy perfectly illustrates this general perspective. In the 1970s, the alternative technology movement promoted renewable energy as the basis for producing energy in ways that would be more socially cooperative, environmentally sustainable, locally accountable, and so on. Nuclear power was rightly seen as a threat to such alternatives, as well as a threat to the environment and democracy. When the UK government announced a whole new generation of nuclear power plants, anti-nuclear groups sprung up near the sites of the proposed plants, and they formed a national network linked with their counterparts throughout Europe. But at least in this country, the anti-nuclear movement quickly became trapped into a narrow debate of where they were playing or pushed into playing the role of counter-experts. And this great debate was framed as the energy gap, whether or how much energy demand would increase in the future, exceeding the available supply, what were the options to fill the gap, what were the costs of the various options, the relative risk and safety, and so on. So we published this booklet called Nuclear Power Crossed Out Great, the Rig Debate. And we renamed our group itself. From the Nuclear Power Group in BSSRS, we renamed ourselves as the Politics of Energy Group in order to emphasize the political and ideological aspects of the conflict over energy futures. The introduction posed this question: why is the whole anti-nuclear movement frustrated with this mainstream debate? Because the real reasons behind nuclear power are being hidden. They have nothing to do with energy gaps. So we critically examine what is the problem and the implications for action. He said, in reality, the nuclear plant program is being driven by military links, nuclear technology export, and the drive for technical and political control of the energy supply. And in the inside back cover, we gave a quote from leaked minutes of a cabinet subcommittee meeting, 79. Quote, a nuclear program would have the advantage of removing a substantial portion of electricity production from the dangers of disruption by industrial action, by coal miners or transport workers. We juxtapose this with a favorite quote from Karl Marx, Capital. It would be possible to write a history of the inventions made since 1830 for the sole purpose of supplying capital with weapons against the revolt of the working class. And then we promoted the book by Robert Jung, The Nuclear State, where he describes safety procedures intentionally designed to protect management from workers' collective power. We quoted the director of nuclear safeguard program at Los Alamos, quote, in atomic institutions, we must leave as much as possible to non-human colleagues, in other words, apparatus. Not only are they more reliable, they are also cheaper. So we drew on these critical perspectives about technology, its design, its socio-political role, in order to raise a debate about the alternatives as well, because we could already see the initial signs of the mainstream energy industry looking at renewable technologies, which were supported by the anti-nuclear movement as alternatives. We said alternative technology will not become radical technology without a political fight. And we pose the question of what would be that political fight as a strategic question for the whole movement. We posed these questions for debate in the movement. In cost-benefit analyses, who receives the benefit, and is it the sort of benefit that could ever be shared by the whole society? How much of the real social cost of nuclear power is acknowledged as a cost to be paid for in money terms? What does it mean to assess the relative safety of different technologies? Is there really such a thing as technologies which are safer than others? How can we learn to treat safety as a question of workers' control and knowledge rather than something in the apparatus? And how can we understand the vulnerabilities of the nuclear labor process, the nuclear cycle, as opportunities for blocking the fuel cycle, rather than merely as safety defects which need to be exposed and then somehow managed or corrected by the managers? In choosing technologies, should the priority be one of saving labor, a claim made for both nuclear and solar, right? Or rather, one of creating worthwhile sorts of work which encourages workers' knowledge and control? Can such technologies be identified simply according to whether they are soft or decentralized or some other inherent characteristic? Now I go to the present. 4 decades later, there are continuities and differences with the debate that we tried to create, the issues we tried to identify and analyze critically. Now, energy is bound up with two new issues: security of supply, now focusing more on dependence on foreign imports from Russia as well as the Middle East, as well as climate change, where everything hinges on claims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And both these, security, climate change, have become dual means for again depoliticizing energy issues through yet more technologies. Technologies to obtain long-term reliable supplies, technologies for reducing emissions, so-called low-carbon technologies, capturing emissions from fossil fuels, and even engineering the climate to try to mitigate or undo the damage. These fixes have been rightly attacked by the radical movements as false solutions, which then perpetuate the same basic patterns of production and consumption as before. But we need to apply the critical perspective also to renewable energy, which has an implicit politics. Renewable energy, especially in the past decade, has been expanded greatly, and to some extent through community initiatives, for example, in places remote from national grids, as well as by municipal community movements. But renewable energy has been largely appropriated by the major energy companies as extra inputs into the same system, into national centralized grids, into fuel systems for the internal combustion engine, and so on, in ways that keep the sources invisible to consumers, who thereby have no obvious means to judge what to oppose or support. And meanwhile, the government schemes are paying enormous subsidies for so-called renewable energy, so-called low-carbon energy. And a similar pattern is being extended to novel energy technologies, which are hardly known even to activists, like gasification. Through this appropriation of renewable energy by state and capital, the agenda preempts alternative societal futures of the sort that were originally associated with renewable energy. There have been attempts to create different futures, especially through municipal or community-owned grids, which would gain control over the energy supply. These localization initiatives have arisen in many places in Europe, often just succeeding despite the energy incumbents, the big energy companies. In particular, Danish social movements have promoted decentralized, small-scale forms of renewable energy. Berlin had a campaign for, quote, social and ecological community-owned energy supply to create their own grid, to take away the political power from the major energy companies, and this got enormous support, what was outmaneuvered in the referendum. Now, just briefly, in this country, the center of such discussions has been, to some extent, the campaign against climate change, which of course opposes all fossil fuels.
2 minutes.
Yes. While also counterposing alternatives. In particular, they promoted the report that was coordinated by the CAT, called Zero Carbon Britain 2030, which plays on the metaphor of a computer starting up. An integrated approach involves powering down, meaning reducing energy wastage, and powering up, deploying renewable energies, combined with changes in lifestyle and land use. This means localization, decentralized energy production through microgrids, localized energy supplies, less need to transport energy or goods, energy efficient structural changes in buildings, and so on. So the report does an impressive job of demonstrating how all these improvements would be possible using available technologies and domestic resources, not needing to import anything. But, by analogy now to tendencies in the 70s, the term power refers only to energy in that technical sense and flows of resources to produce the energy, not to power meaning politics. And nothing is said, and very little is said even by the campaign against climate change about what political economic interests drive the current system, and therefore what counterpower, what political alliances will be necessary to disrupt that system and change it into something that we would want. So just in conclusion, back in the 70s and 80s, the radical science movement critically analyzed how techno-fixes depoliticize issues and preempt societal choices, whereby technologies, alternative technologies meant to stimulate, facilitate a different society remain marginal or even become complementary, become appropriated by the dominant system. So we need means to develop strategies against that dominant system and promote alternatives which can play a radical role, which can become radical technology. Such perspectives on techno-fixes are more relevant now than ever.